As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Okay. Welcome to...
Sorry.
Welcome to... Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. We've assembled a very literary cast of characters, sitting with Ian, Kyle, and Martin. And I appreciate this particular group because they're the ones that make me feel as though I've never read a book. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I look at Ian and I'm like, he asked me, what are you reading right now? I'm like, you've probably read it because you've read everything. And then I say, I'm reading, what I'm reading. And he's like, oh yeah, I read that. I know. But Ian, what are you reading right now?
So I am reading through Don Quixote. I mean, I've just started because we're doing that in a book club. And I've still been working through Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls, but I've kind of stopped. I've been paused on my reading for a bit. Yeah. Don Quixote.
Slowed down a little bit. And you're reading Don Quixote, the first novel, and that's a helpful segue.
Yeah.
This conversation is going to be about the novel. Because our Memoria Press literature is 95% novels. And I think it's maybe 80% if you think about the plays. So I think that's worth talking about. So that's where we're headed. And you're reading what many people would consider the first novel.
Sure.
Thoughts on Don Quixote?
So far, it's hilarious. I mean, I want to be aware of why that's so, why people call it the first novel. So I've read the little introduction, which I typically do because they often give you, good signposts to look for as you're reading the book. Sometimes introductions aren't great, but most of the time they're helpful. And so I've done that. I'm seeing how he's satirizing a lot of things, and so it's fun. But I'm only a handful of chapters in, so it's yet to I'm yet to see what's really new about it.
Yeah. Martin, are you an introductions guy? Do you read introductions to novels?
I do. I think that there's certain literary forms that we really undervalue, and introductions are one of them. Book reviews, introductions. I think these are actually important genres that don't tend to get much love in our world. And in fact, I was told the other day that publishers don't want to do book reviews anymore. But I think, I've seen, if you look at collections of like people like Joseph Epstein, one of my favorite essayists, when they put the collections together, they have his introductions to certain books in there. It was only through, Kyle will appreciate this, it was only because I read Irving Howe's introduction to Moby Dick that I read Moby Dick. He convinced me in that introduction. It's a brilliant introduction that I should read it, and I did. And so I think they're very important.
Yeah, Martin, what are you reading right now?
I'm still, and I may have mentioned this in a previous podcast because I'm going a little slow right now. The Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. As I've said before, I read several books at the same time.
Some tough Greek in there.
Huh?
Some tough Greek in there.
Yeah. And not as much in the English though. So I'm reading Peloponnesian War, which is a classic. I try to always be reading a classic. I'm reading a novel. I'm still in Lorna Doone by, I think it's R.W. Blackmore, a very early novel, but it's interesting. Ian was talking about Don Quixote, how you go back and I always think that certain characteristics are much later, that the sophistication comes much later. Actually, you go early, and Lorna Doone is early. Don Quixote is at very early, and yet there's things that have sprung fully formed from the head of Zeus, so to speak. The irony in Don Quixote. Irony is the controlling literary mode of our age. Sort of looking down on things and making fun of them. And that's there fully formed in Don Quixote in a Spanish work.
I've already noticed that in just the first several chapters.
Yes, absolutely.
Which gives it humor
And then in the second part of it, which he writes later, he's ironizing the first. It's just amazing what he's doing in there. So Lorna Doone is that way. And then I'm listening to Louis Marcos's From Plato to Postmodernism, A History of Literary Criticism, which is for about the 5th time because it's so good. And so that's what I'm.
Nice. And you also are reading at least one essay. Last night, a group of us got together to discuss by a professor at University of Virginia in 1987, I think is when he published it. I can't remember his name.
Michael Askelman.
Michael Askelman. So that was pretty. So you're reading that as well, and you're always kind of reading these things that we get together to discuss.
Yeah.
Kyle, what have you been reading recently?
So I've got a fiction going and a nonfiction going. The nonfiction I'm reading I'm rereading Roger Scruton's little book on beauty, Beauty, a very short introduction, which is fantastic. And the fiction I'm reading is Steinbeck's East of Eden, which is very well written. It's a beautiful novel, and the scope is impressive.
Are you about to criticize Steinbeck on my podcast?
Yes, I am.
All right.
But it's a beautiful novel, and the scope is impressive. But I think ultimately what he's saying is, I think false. I have about 100 pages left. And I don't know if I can get fully on board with his point in the novel or his focus. But I'm enjoying the read.
So what is the point?
I think Steinbeck, I think East of Eden, I will say, is a materialistic book. And I think he's searching for, the means by which to pursue, something meaningful and something good in a materialistic world. And yeah, I mean, and I think his focus on his overwhelming focus on what makes the world go round and what brings goodness out of evil, or goodness instead of evil, is human choice. Just that the human, our responsibility and our freedom to make the right choice instead of the wrong choice. And this is where we get the contrast between good and evil.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, because what the thing I find in Steinbeck, who's probably my favorite American novelist, is meaning. It's just filled with meaning, and unlike Hemingway, where it at least is harder to see. So if his focus is real, how can a materialist really even believe in meaning? I mean, but Steinbeck really does.
Do you think that's because of choice? Like what he's doing is saying, like, we must choose to find this meaning in our lives. Like it seems like that's a pretty common existentialist move.
Yeah. So I think so. So the villain in the novel is sort of evil, inexplicable evil. And the answer that I see so far, and because it's the retelling, a couple of retellings of the Cain and Abel story, and the answer so far is it all comes down to Cain's choice of how is Cain going to respond to the situation that he's in with Abel being accepted and Cain being rejected. The entire meaning of the human race, I think, for this novel, boils down to, is Cain going to choose, the path of vengeance and murder and evil, or is he going to choose, which I guess I haven't gotten to, what Steinbeck would put as the alternative to the negative choice. But even that, I'm not sure that is what the meaning of the human race boils down to.
Yeah. Well, it's a great book. I read it.
Yeah, it is a great book. Certainly a great book.
Nice. I'm reading something a little lower on the shelf. So I've been reading T.H. White's Once and Future King,
which is a great book.
Series of novels written in the 30s about the Arthurian legends. They're like, I can't decide what level they're on. They're kind of between Lewis and Tolkien in terms of difficulty. They're like junior high school, too like difficult for junior high, but like high school, I guess. I don't know. What do you think?
I would think so. I mean, I read it when I was a kid, but I read it again as an adult. And I mean, we all have the experience of reading something again as an adult and finding so much more there. But the humor in The Once and Future King is just it's so great.
It's definitely sophisticated.
It's sophisticated humor while telling a story at a simple level that a child can really understand. So there's really levels of enjoyment that I think you can have.
And it ironizes the Arthurian story.
That's right.
It was what's so interesting about it.
Yeah.
So
And why it's funny.
Yeah, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Just finished the first of the 4 novels, Sword in the Stone, and I've just started the second novel. But an interesting connection, I'm also reading a nonfiction and a fiction, and I've been reading through Plato's Republic, and I'm in book 3. And what's interesting is that the Once and Future King, written right at the time of World War II, really a huge theme. Like very beginning of Sword in the Stone, Merlin summons Poseidon as he's giving an education to the wart, young King Arthur, and he turns them both into fish, and they go meet the King of the Pike. And the King of the Pike says, might makes right. And then that is a theme they return to. In Plato's Republic, the whole question of the book is what is justice? And the conversation is started by Thrasymachus, who says that justice is the interest of the stronger. That's what justice is. And Socrates is responding to might makes right throughout the entire rest of the novels. I thought that was kind of interesting that perennial question is kind of underneath of both, but enjoying both quite a bit. That being said, another thing that I've found interesting about Plato's Republic is that in book 2, or maybe it's 3, when he's discussing those things that should be forbidden in the true city, he talks about 2 ways of telling a story. There's imitation and there's narrative. And he divides imitation from narrative. Basically, that's when there's a narrator and when there's dialogue. In some ways, the novel is a form of art unlike the comedy and tragedy, unlike a play, where imitation and narrative are combined. That's one way you could talk about the novel and what a novel actually is. But I think it'd be worth exploring. Most of the Memoria Press literature curriculum are novels. Why do we have our students read so many novels when that form doesn't necessarily go all the way back? And what is a novel itself?
Well, I think you started on an interesting insight there, that it's some kind of combination between the dialogue form and really the myth. I mean, it's a way of it's a modern self, because the thing I think that distinguishes modern thought is this self-reflective self. I mean, Hamlet is the first time I know of where somebody's talking to themselves. We've split ourselves. We now have selves in the world rather than being just the locus of consciousness. So I think that the novel is the form that's responding to that. That we put ourselves in the place of the protagonist,
right?
And we're looking out on the world from the protagonist. So it's both the appropriate literary form and is, I think, the form that was produced by this very thing, this self-consciousness that we have. We now think not only about other people, but we think a lot about ourselves. And so to have that locus of consciousness in the novel, where we can do that in somebody else's character to get out of ourselves.
Yeah. Kyle, how would you, if someone just walked up to you and said, define a novel, how would you answer this question?
I don't know. This is something that I've just wrestled with. And usually it sort of occupies like the back burner of my mind because, I like novels. I like to read them. I'll put that on the.
You don't know what they are, but you like them.
Yeah, and I won't really worry about what they are. But just in terms of it is like, what are the essential differences between other forms? I sometimes wonder: is a novel? I mean, is it almost a lack of form rather than a separate, deliberate form on its own? I don't know. But I did come to, or I've been thinking recently about realism a lot. Just the complexities of realism. I think the causes when any art form becomes realist, why that happens, and then also what kind of different sort of iterations of realism are possible. I think there's I don't know, just put it into like simplistic terms. There's a negative kind of realism or wretchedness in the world, and then there's a positive kind of realism which looks honestly at the wretchedness of the world but finds hope in it. And I don't know that that's directly related to the novel, that novels are sort of inherently realistic, but I don't know. I thought it might be worth bringing up.
Do you think, there's some, you seem to be saying a little bit that it's easier to define a novel by saying what it's not, but then whatever it ends up being, that form seems to lend, I think to Martin's point, some kind of ability to portraying life as it actually is, like in a way that maybe other forms cannot.
Yeah. Well, I think that like first person perspective, just what you're describing, like the self analyzing the self.
Because you read Homer or Virgil, and you don't know their thoughts inside. You just know what they do.
Yeah.
And now we want to get into the psyche.
Well, and which lends itself, I think, possibly to what you might call like an authenticity, if that makes sense as a word. Just my perspective on the world, rather than the somewhat distance between me and the myth, or me and the gods and the heroes outside of Troy. There's sort of this very internal, very authentic, very honest. I guess that's what I mean by realism,
right?
Aspect of the novel.
Yeah, it's always about. They always seem to be about, and I'm sure there's exceptions to this, but how the soul of the protagonist changes because of something. I mean, isn't that what happens in every novel?
Yeah. I think kind of the hero's journey kind of concept.
Yeah, the hero's journey, but it's an internal journey.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, in our curriculum, when you're reading through the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid, those journeys, I mean, the Odyssey is obviously a journey, but it's all external. It's all external. The action happens to the character, and you might get into the character's psyche at times, but the novel is always, not always, but generally internal. I mean, when you read something like The Brothers K or Anna Karenina. I mean, Anna Karenina ends with this fantastic stream of consciousness where you are in Anna's final moments.
Yes.
And that's something that the novel
that doesn't happen to
table.
Achilles changes his mind, but his mind doesn't change.
Yeah.
Odysseus is not a different person by the time at the end of the book. He's the same person, whereas it's always some internal journey for the main character, it seems like in novels.
That enables the epic to start, sing muse of this.
Yeah.
And then the point is we're going to sing about that for the whole.
Yes.
Whereas I don't know the novel can really do that.
Right.
In the same way. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think, so anybody listening is probably thinking of trying to think of exceptions. And that's why before I asked you the question, Ian, we met in the biblical studies world, and I thought you would be outraged at the question because I'm asking you to participate in something that biblical scholars call form criticism.
Yeah, that's right.
That is determining what a thing is and where it came from by strict definitions of form that never work in any way.
That's right.
But Ian, anything to add to our definition of what is a novel? What is that form? And it's obviously not correct, but tell me what you think it is. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, I think we've hit on most things here, and to borrow other legal definitions, you kind of know what a novel is when you see it. Like you can look at it and know it's typically of a certain size and length, and we can have a discussion about novels, novellas, and other kinds of things. But I'm not really interested in that because I think the main thing is already what we've talked about, that there is sort of that internal change in the lives of the characters. I think are more prominent in a novel than in an epic. I mean, you love characters in epics, but you love something about the characters, not necessarily the characters themselves. I mean, you may, and I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but
yeah. Well, in the characters in a lot of classical works are types. They're sort of a representative of a type rather than a modern individual.
That's right. Well, and even in something like, sometimes Dickens may be criticized because a lot of his characters are types. They're often caricatures. But even so, some of his characters are caricatures, but others have that sort of deep inner soul that we're diving into. I mean, you read A Tale of Two Cities and you're getting to know Sidney Carton, and his final act is so powerful because you've gotten to know him and who he is in a way that an epic doesn't.
Right. So trying to shift away from defining a novel kind of by what it's not, which is probably the easiest way. It's not a play. It's not a poem
That's
necessarily. Right. It may bring in elements of those things, but it's not. Another way we could approach this is by talking about the elements of specific novels that we've read, that we've enjoyed, how they've worked on us, and what we've enjoyed about them. So, I'll kick it back to you. What are a couple of novels that you've enjoyed and why?
Sure. So, A Tale of Two Cities has been one of my favorite novels for years. I mean, I read it in high school. I read it again. I listened to it. Had a great narrator, and so it was very fun to listen to, very engaging. But what I love about that is that deep dive into the character of Sidney Carton. That you're introduced by someone who's this, obviously kind of first jealous, depressed figure, and watching his transition from that into a glorious thing in the end, and I don't want to give anything away because that is a novel worth reading to the very end. I love Dickens' language throughout A Tale of Two Cities. I mean, obviously sometimes his symbolism in A Tale of Two Cities is on the nose, but that's okay because it's kind of, he's teaching you, I think in a book like that, especially if you're younger, how to read things, how to see symbols in a text. I mean, I was listening to a talk you were giving about, the wine is blood in the very first, chapter of A Tale of Two Cities. But the thing is if you're reading it for the first time and you're making that connection, it makes your cognition stronger the next time you read a work with more subtle symbols, and so I really enjoy that.
So we could boil down what you're saying to the form of, Tale of Two Cities helped you understand characterization.
Exactly right.
Complex characterization.
That's right.
And symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
The use of both.
That's right.
Kyle, what about you?
Can I have two?
Of course.
I have two. Because my first...
Would you like three?
Well, yeah, I mean, as many as... Yeah. No, but I guess I'll start, and I just thinking in terms of novels that just in my thinking, I keep falling back on whatever that novel has done, whatever that novel does, just to explain, kind of explain the world to me in a way. And the novel that kept on coming to mind is Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which it's like my thinking about the world cannot get away from that novel, and I'm so close to it, I prepare myself to tell people about this novel because the overwhelming response I get about this novel is that it's just dark and it's depressing. And why would the author do this to me? And then,
I totally agree with that.
Yeah. So I think this novel does so much that it's really hard for me to kind of make a defense of it, but I want to try briefly.
It's like defending a roaring lion. Am I right?
Oh, but the power and the beauty of it, right? So, So I've not run across a novel that's so well. I mean, you mentioned Tale of Two Cities, which is great, and I'm not disparaging anything like A Tale of Two Cities, but the theme of self-sacrifice, you see that everywhere, and I think in that novel Dickens does it particularly well.
Right.
But it's a relatively easy sell, and it's a relatively easy story. I guess post-Christianity, a relatively easy story to tell. Bronte in Wuthering Heights is giving, I think, just one of the best portrayals of long suffering, by which I mean the kind of self-sacrifice. I think of it as like a hopeful self-neglect, a kind of self-sacrifice that spreads itself over an entire life, which I wonder if that's something particular to what we were saying about the novel form in general, that it can look at something spread over an entire life. Mm-hmm. But the character of Nellie in Wuthering Heights she is long-suffering, she's meek, not because she's timid or because she's afraid, but because she's hopeful in better things than this world. And by the end of the novel, I don't think it's any spoiler to say, the meek inherit the earth by the end of the novel. And I think it's just one of the most true and powerful expressions of that. All of that, you talk about novels that teach readers how to read, which is, I teach English. This is a very important subject to me. That novel, all of that is set within a frame narrative. Wuthering Heights is written at a frame narrative, which means we have basically the character Lockwood is hearing the story of Wuthering Heights along with us. So he's reading, in a sense, the novel with us. And he's reading it poorly. There are little moments that Bronte puts in where you get Lockwood's response to the story. And he's not doing a very good job of seeing its depth and its meaning and the significance of this virtue of long suffering. And I think Bronte is showing us by that the contrast, that the long suffering is the virtue that she's holding up. And in the opposite to that is the self-centeredness and the self-focus that, one, makes us poor people, gives us a poor character as in our interactions with others, but also makes us poor readers. So she's doing this thing in this novel where she's connecting that Christian virtue to good readership and the virtue of reading well, which I find, it blows me away, that the importance, I would call it importance of that novel. So that's one. That's Wuthering Heights.
I get the sense that you like Wuthering Heights.
I really, really do. But again, it's not. It's an important novel, right? I don't want to insist. It's a beautiful novel, I think, too. It's just very, very well put together. But it says something that needs to be said, and says it well and says it articulately. So, I like Wuthering Heights. Yeah, my answer for my other novel is a lot shorter. And that's The Great Gatsby. And I just want to read, this is another thing that novels can do. I brought a copy to give you this example. Very short. Right at the beginning, this is just a description of the Buchanan's house. It's describing a house. It says, the lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. That's a description of someone's yard. And
right.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, and so that's what I love about The Great Gatsby. Is just the words and the sentences.
Yeah, that's good. And I think especially that point is helpful when we talk about poetry versus novel versus play. What is a novel? It kind of, where poetry can be extremely precise in the way that it reflects our experience of beauty, novels sometimes bring that precision but lay it in a context for us of a story, of a greater story, of characters and people moving. And so it takes that beauty that maybe you've experienced in poetry and contextualizes it. Mm-hmm. Martin, what would be a novel that you've enjoyed and you've enjoyed exploring over the years?
Probably Anna Karenina. I think that's probably my favorite novel. And, we're talking about this sort of the psychological journey of characters. You have this sort of cross at the center of Anna Karenina because you have two journeys going on and they're going opposite directions. Because you have Levin going to heaven and you have Kitty going to hell. And the way their lives cross over each other at various points in the book, and just this very abstracted life of somebody without virtue, who seems to have it at the beginning, but she just becomes corrupted, and Levin, who lives, he's basically a person from the country. Not this, as in a lot of novels, there's the country mouse and the town mouse, right? And a lot of the greatest of our literature takes place in the country, or there's themes from the country about it. You have Tolstoy's writing about the country, and Dostoevsky, whose stories all take place in the city. City's a place of evil in many ways, of corruption. So, and I just love the way that Tolstoy embodies everything. I think this is what the greatest novels do, is they don't tell you, they show you. And the significance of the stories is not in anything that they say explicitly. It's in the actions of the characters, the form of the plot, and even the setting, as I just pointed out, is significant. And so I think those are the virtues of a great novel.
Yeah, I think I would point to The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I think is a great example of a novel that I love, and on a couple of different levels. Ian, you mentioned symbolism. I mean, it's a novel dripping with symbolism. Maybe too much in some ways, but it's a dripping with symbolism in a way that I think really does take this story and move it to a level of theologizing and showing the ultimate meaning of many of the actions of these characters in a way that's very persuasive. I think another piece is that Hawthorne, in writing the novel, is extremely funny. Mm-hmm. And there's a way that if you are the narrator telling a story rather than in a play or a poem, if you're the narrator, then you can describe events in a way that the characters themselves don't perceive, or in a way that they do perceive, but you as the audience don't quite understand. So there's different ways that you can play with the perspective of the speaker, and Hawthorne does all of those things as he's telling the story. And then I think last is that he sets it in a historical context that I find interesting. He sets it up talking about his grandfathers, the Puritans, and then he talks. This is Hawthorne as not a Puritan, reflecting on Puritanism and its historical setting. And I think he's actually more judicious than probably people give him credit for in portraying the early Puritan settlements. And so I think it's a great example of a novel that operates on all those different levels.
Well, that's the other thing. The novel, the form of the novel has so many variety. There's so much variety in the way that it can be done. You have the omniscient narrator like in Tolstoy, or you can have the first person narration. You can have what is technically first person narration, but is really omniscient narrator in Brothers Karamazov. There's just so many varieties and ways that it can be done, and yet it maintains itself as a distinct form. I think that's really
flexibility seems to be its defining characteristic, which is not helpful for categorization or description.
And can I make one more remark? And this hit me when I read Jane Eyre, but it could be obviously true of Wuthering Heights and really Fitzgerald. And these people are not people who are trained in university writing departments. These are people living out in the country who are just normal people. I mean, Charlotte Bronte, she's just an everyday person, and yet she is this vessel of Western culture, living out there in the country, not having even a real great formal education, and she writes this book. And I did for some reason that just struck me when I read that book, and then I realized, well, really, they're all that way. All the great novelists are this way. How did they achieve this? How did they learn to be great artists basically on their own? Well, it wasn't really on their own. It was because they were recipients of the Western tradition, and they read the previous works by previous people in the Western tradition. And it's not really something centered in our houses of learning. It's something that they just got by accessing the tradition itself, which is what our institutions of learning used to do, is connect us with that tradition, but they don't do that very well.
Mm-hmm. So that transitions us to my next question would be that, the Memoria Press materials or literature curriculum is largely novels, and that's why I chose this topic. So speak to the students who are in these programs, or the parents of students in these programs, or teachers teaching these programs. What is your word to people who are high school students struggling with Tale of Two Cities? Or, the teacher who doesn't quite get The Great Gatsby? What are our on-ramps into this form? Why is it actually beneficial? And why would you defend the primacy of novel in our curriculum over? We do have poetry, we do have plays, but there's not as many as there are novels.
I think I want to start first with a Christian perspective and maybe a theological perspective, because I think that will speak to a lot of us. And this may not be universally applicable, but story is so important to who we are. We respond to stories. And one of the things that I was thinking about as we were talking about form earlier, you have the great epics that had a very clear form. They were poetic in nature, and they called the muses, and there were these distinct moments throughout that are replicated in other epic poems. But then you have in the Jewish and later Christian tradition, the Bible, which really combines a lot of these forms together. You've got poetry, you got poetic texts, you got narrative from the very beginning. I mean, the earliest books are narrative, and maybe poetry in Job or something like that based on your opinions on these matters. And then you get to the Gospels, and in the Christian tradition, it's story, it's narrative. And so what we're doing when we're reading books is we're participating in a tradition that prioritizes and prizes story as something meaningful to us, as something that can change us, as something that gives us, paths to follow in principles. And so that's one thing. That's just one way to think about it.
Well, I think that speaks to the issue that that education is primarily moral.
Mm-hmm.
And as people like Alistair McIntyre have pointed out, you can't see what morality is outside of the context of a story,
Right.
of a narrative. You can't know if you're a good person unless unless you can see yourself as a good character in your own story. And so I think the novel is extremely important because it gives us practice in how to see a life as part of a larger story and what your role is in it, just as part of the whole moral instruction that you are implicitly getting in any good education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ian, your comment about Job made me think of, have you heard that theory that Job is actually an early Hebrew tragedy? And that it was performed like a play?
But
what's your take on that?
I don't have any take on that. I have no opinion on that, but I have heard that.
Yeah. There is actually a Greek tragedy
Yes.
called The Life of Moses that was written about him pre-Christ. And so, it could be an early antecedent.
That's right.
Well, Job is my favorite book of the Bible.
Yeah.
Actually, it's just so fascinating to me, and I have not heard that this is some new theory, but it sort of makes sense. It's a cosmic tragedy,
Right.
And it just speaks to the whole condition of man and the finitude of man, and how we are beings who strive to understand, but we're also beings who are incapable of totally understanding.
Right.
And God just comes and puts us in our place and reminds us, and this is a good reminder for modern people, and reminds us that we are not the subject and God the object, that God is the subject and we are the objects. And we have to, in asking our questions, which they're fine to ask, that we need to remember that God has everything under control and that we don't know everything. That speech out of the whirlwind at the end, and that seems to be clear to me.
That's in answer, like back to the question about what is the advice to teachers, or can't necessarily get into the novel or understand. Just there's a difference, I think, between teaching what this novel says, right? Sort of explicitly, like what's the message, versus teaching how to read a novel.
Yes,
right.
I agree with that.
And that doesn't mean that your selection of books is just random, right? There are some novels that teach better than other novels. But I think overall the point is you to teach students how to read exactly because it's that virtue. I mean, that goes. I think this is what Bronte is doing in Wuthering Heights. It's that virtue that what you just said about God is the object. And we are subject.
I think Martin's point was that God is subject in the sense that he's the actor and we are the acted upon. But your point
I'm reversing. I agree. I'm misusing the words. So I agree with you. But reverse the words in my brain. But it puts us learning how to read well. Puts us in that posture of being sort of at the feet of the novel is like being at the feet of God, right? Mm-hmm. Or Job laying his hand over his mouth is, I look at Job in that moment and I think he's reading well, rather than trying to author his own narrative, rather than trying to assert himself. He is listening to God's assertion of himself.
Right.
And that's
and this is why
helpful.
I like, there's all these arguments about, and I think a lot of bias in modern criticism against the omniscient narrator, because I think that form implies that there is a God.
Mm.
And I think if you don't believe in God, then you're not going to like the omniscient narrator in a novel.
Yes.
and so I think that whole training in seeing the world from a God's eye perspective is important for us as believers in God.
Yeah. Kyle, you're speaking to the importance of being a humble and attentive reader.
Yeah.
How do you encourage students in your classes to be, are there any general things that you're saying, or is it more specific to particular texts?
Yeah. No, it's a, I think a lot of the great authors are doing this consciously. There's a scene in Wuthering Heights again. I'm obsessed.
Yes, I think officially certifiably you are.
Yeah, a different novel that whose title also begins with W, Wind in the Willows. There's a scene in Wind in the Willows where they're lost in the wildwood, and Mole trips over something and cuts his leg. And if you go through it briefly, if you don't know the scene, because it's beautiful. He trips and cuts his leg. Mole is upset because he's hurt. Versus Ratty, who his friend, the water rat, is digging through the snow trying to establish what it was that cut him so cleanly. It's a very, it's a clean, it's not a jagged cut. He digs in the snow and he finds a door scraper, which I'm not sure I know what a door scraper is, but I assume it's some sort of shovel for removing snow from a doorway.
I was always confused by that as well.
Yeah. Well, Ratty starts celebrating and dancing up and down in the snow, as though they're saved from being lost in the woods. And Mole is bothered by this because, hey, I'm hurt here. Why are you happy? And Ratty keeps saying to him, don't you realize what this means? Don't you realize, like, where there's a door scraper, there's a door, and if there's a door, there's salvation. We're not lost in the woods anymore. I don't know how practical and helpful that is, but that's where my mind goes in the sense of the proper posture in approaching a novel. Like there is, there's rescue, there are answers, there's meaning to be found in a novel. And that's, as students are very inclined to focus on, I've been hurt and I'm upset about that, or I'm hungry and I want to go to lunch. Right, they're very inward turned, and I think the novel's job, the teacher's job, is just through the example of the text itself to show the virtue of pulling them out of that. There are bigger things going on.
Sympathy.
Sympathy.
That's a great example from Wind in the Willows. It's so great, in fact, that I do this one speech for teacher trainings that I do where I use that exact example for wisdom. And now I'm a little concerned I stole it from you. And I didn't know it.
I'd be happy to take credit for that.
Martin, any final advice for students or teachers of the form of the novel? What's a way to access these books? What do you encourage someone with who is struggling with long novels?
Well, there's several questions there, I guess, but I think that it's just important to be able to share your own enthusiasm for these books. I think that a good teacher is he's ethos and logos in the sense that he's got his own knowledge that he brings to the situation, and there's certain explicit things that you can say about the novel. But I think the pathos is also important, that you need to share your love for these books. And you have to somehow be able to communicate, like Kyle just did, why you love this book. And do it in a way that they're getting some of your energy for this. And that's not something you can learn very well as a teacher. A lot of that, quite frankly, is innate. But if you can love this stuff as much as you should, and you can somehow share that love with your students, this will change them. I've seen it many, many times. If they can see themselves as a protagonist in a story, you will change their life.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, I've enjoyed this conversation with you guys about novels. Thanks for being here.
Thank Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Classical Etc. If you'd like to show your support for the show, then you can leave a like below. If you'd like to add your voice to the conversation, then you can comment. And if you want to follow along with us on this journey, then please subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you later.